Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Well, hello and welcome to a special edition of The Nest. Ben Waterworth is our resident draft expert on The Nest. I'm about to jet set away on holiday.
Tough life for some.
So I thought I would just leave the Nest family with just something to get us excited ahead of the draft. It is still just under a month away, Ben.
Yes.
First of all, good to see you.
Nice to see you too, Drew. I've a lot of career highlights talking to you on air in recent times, so I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, Twitter Spaces.
Yes.
That's now a bygone era. But no, we do appreciate your time.
Happy to help, mate.
And given we've won 4 games in 2 years, or 5 games in 2 years, West Coast fans have spent more time than we're used to actually looking at the draft and young prospects and whatnot. And this is just a fascinating year, isn't it? So the big question I think a lot of West Coast fans have, because 99% of us as the general football populace haven't seen that much of Harley Reid, but we've heard a lot about him. So when people say generational talent for someone like you who does watch the draft closely, where do you place Harley in terms of number one prospects over the years?
I find it hard to rank him, so I tend to go back to recruiters, and a lot of recruiters I speak to think that Nick Dacos was probably the best player that's come through the draft in recent years, and a lot of people would say Harley would be second. Another recruiter I spoke to at the start of the year, who would have 10, 15 years in the industry, would say that Harley Reid's the best prospect that he's ever seen come through the system. So the thing that probably sets Harley Reid apart from the likes of Nick Dacos and Sam Walsh and Matt Rowell before him is that he can genuinely play across all 3 lines. So everyone compares him to Dustin Martin and that power, but I reckon Harley Reid's got overhead marking above what you don't see Dusty take too many overhead marks, but Harley Reid as a bottom major in the as an under 17 playing for Vic Country in the under 18s last year, won All Australian selection as essentially an intercept marker and had a kicking efficiency of 86%, one of the best intercept marks in the national championships. And then he can also go forward. We've seen him go forward this year in particular for Bendigo Pioneers and win games and kick pretty big hauls. And he averaged the most clearances in the champs for Vic Country this year as well. He can genuinely play across all 3 lines. Generational talent's huge, and on the face value, it's probably far too premature to be talking about an 18-year-old prospect who hasn't played an AFL game yet in that kind of light. But I would say that, I've been watching the draft pretty closely for 8 years, I think, and I probably didn't see as much as Nick Dacos as I've seen of Harley Reid in recent years. But so I would say that Reid's the best prospect that I've seen come through the draft. The talent pathway.
Is the gap between what Harley Reid is currently showing talent-wise and promise-wise, is it bigger than normal than what we see between, say, the number 1 pick and the next available player?
Probably not, because Jed Walter is a very, very good prospect.
But Jed Walter isn't available for
He isn't. So on the open draft pool, I think there's a big gap then. So I did rankings recently, and I had Harley Reid 1, Jed Walter 2, and Colby McKercher from Tasmania number 3. McKercher is the best pure midfield prospect in the draft, and there's a good chance that he's not getting past North Melbourne or Hawthorn if the picks stay the same. I think North Melbourne like him with one of their 2 selections. But I still think there's a significant gap between Reid and McKercher because of Reid's ability to play across all 3 lines. McKercher's a very, very fine player.
You say Zach Merritt was a similar type player?
Yeah, that's the player that recruiters compared him to before I'd sort of seen a lot of him this year, and then you watch him play and it's the first player you think of.
So Zane Dersma, are there similarities with him and Harry Sheasel in terms of the sort of half forward?
Yeah, a little bit.
Skillful in terms of the way that they've come through. Obviously, what Sheasel's done now is separate to that. But is Dersma in that sort of category?
A little bit. He's a little bit taller, Dersma. He's 189, so he's a little bit taller than Sheasel. And for instance, I couldn't see Dersma going behind the ball like what Harry Sheasel could. But so Dersma's probably a little bit more of a higher, taller half forward that would pinch hit in the midfield, whereas Sheasel was a little bit more creative and crafty. But I think Dersma is raw, and it'd be hard for me to see him playing round one next year. Okay. But I think he's got enormous upside.
So Daniel Curtin is the other one, and perhaps you haven't seen quite as much of him just due to the fact that he's over in WA. Yep. You've watched.
Saw him play for WA
championships. Yep. Yeah. So is he realistically, in your mind, is he good enough for West Coast to be sitting down around a table like this and saying, do we want Daniel Curtin for A, because he's the WA boy, but B, because he's got this amazing talent? Like, is he good enough to be in those conversations?
Yeah, I think he sits in the top 7 somewhere, but whether he is right at the top echelon to the point where the West Coast want to consider trading down so they can still be able to get him, I don't know. Like, he's been a really solid, consistent player. Does he have the superstar factor and game breaking factor that a Walter, a Reed, a McKerch, a Dersma have? You could probably argue not, but he's incredibly consistent and versatile. So and it depends what the Eagles want in the end as well. It's a little bit, I suppose, at the same time though, it's a little bit different because when you're at the top of the draft, you're normally picking best available. But I think almost from 7, 8, maybe even 9 onwards this year, you might be picking on your list needs. So the West Coast need a key defender. Well, they've just ensured that Tom Barrass is going to see out his contract. Jeremy McGovern has re-signed another contract. Do you need another key defender? Because Daniel Curtin played exceptionally well as a key defender for Claremont at Waffle League level this year. Or can you see him developing into a 194, 195 centimetre midfielder, which I saw at the chance. And I looked at him play, and he just looked like Marcus. There's a lot of Marcus Bontempelli traits about the tall left footer, good inside and outside, very composed, kicking away from stoppage. Probably didn't have the same explosion as Bontempelli, but there was just looked like he had that same composure. So he's got great attributes and very consistent throughout the year. But yeah, I don't know if he's the game breaker like a lot of other top fivers are in this draft.
So I guess what West Coast are thinking in a perfect world is if they were trading pick 1, they want Daniel Curtin.
Yep.
And then they want one of probably McKercher, Dersma. I mean, probably out of those two. And this is the difficulty, is that they're not going to settle probably for less than that.
Yeah.
So North may have to give up, say, pick 2 or 3.
They have to give up one of those two.
Well, let's say at least one of the two, if not both. But if North could get their hands on like Melbourne's pick, which is now they've traded into 5. Is it 5 or 6?
I wonder if we're talking about this on a rival Fox Footy podcast yesterday, Drew. We were predicting would West Coast trade pick 1, and 2, what could the deal look like? Now throughout the year, I reckon. So when West Coast and North Melbourne traded ladder positions, I reckon I was about 70% certain that West Coast would trade the pick. That's probably a little bit closer to 55-45 now, and still in favour of West Coast trading the pick. So I still think it'll happen. I'm less confident than what I was a couple of weeks ago. But I think it'll happen, and I reckon North will have to use one of 2 or 3. And then they can probably throw in their future first in there. And then I wonder if they try and make a play for Geelong's pick. So Geelong's pick 8 is on the table. Recruiters tell me that it's probably at a pretty high price at the moment, maybe too unrealistic. But I wonder if North Melbourne use 2 of 15, 17 and 18 to try and move up into pick 8, because the Cats don't have a lot of picks in this year's draft. So do they try and move into pick 8 there, then offer that as part of the deal to West Coast, because that might appease parties a little bit more than, because we know about Brady Rawlings confirmed after the trade period that they threw up their 3 first rounders.
Why did they do that?
I don't know. It's pretty disrespectful. Yeah, they were never going to. I think it was just a starting point, and it was just. I think it signified though, in general, that there are going to be a lot of offers thrown, not only by North Melbourne, but by a couple of clubs at West Coast right up until draft night. And if West Coast move, Drew, it won't be until draft night.
Okay, so is there a world where they can get West Coast can get Curtin and one of those highly rated midfielders? Like, do the maths work out with
potentially?
Because that feels to me like that's the way that it happens. They're not going to settle for pick 8 or 9 if it doesn't get them where they need to be there.
There's a theory going around that Curtin could slide because I don't know. Cause it sounds like Hawthorn, Western Bulldogs, who now have Gold Coast pick, and Melbourne are keen on getting ball winners.
Yep.
And not after key defenders as such. Certainly Western Bulldogs aren't after key defenders.
So who's the first club that you could see drafting Curtin? I'll give you a second to bring up the indicative.
No, I reckon Geelong, to be honest. So it goes all the way down to the Giants, right? And the Giants have picked 7 at the moment. And they're not going to... I don't think they're taking a key defender.
They've got Buckley. They've got Sam Taylor.
Yeah, Connor Iden's had a really good final series, a little bit undersized. But I can't see the Giants taking Curtin. So is it a point where if the Eagles do that trade and they've got 2 and 3, they've got one of 2 and 3, do they trade up to the Giants' pick there to get ahead of... Oh yeah, or just Curtin to slide there. Like there was a bit of talk around last year about whether Ruben Jinby would be taken by Gold Coast or Hawthorn, but he ultimately slid to the Eagles. And the Eagles got their wish without having to do another trade.
Yeah, and so the Eagles, and that was the same with Elisha Hewitt, wasn't it? They essentially worked out that he wasn't going to be taken in that top sort of 11 or 12, so they were able to slot into that position and get him. So that is interesting because I think there has been a feeling that maybe North Melbourne would take Curtin because they need to keep that.
I think North Melbourne should take Curtin. And Brady Rawlings told members in July, I think it was,
they've been drafting too many bids.
Yeah, they know that they have not drafted at all in recent years. But then they went and got Toby Pink as a delisted free agent in the Sandful.
So if things stay how they are, what would North do with 2 and 3? Would they go Dursby, McKercher?
I think so. It's been put to me that definitely one of their picks would be Dursma.
Yeah. Because he offers something a bit different.
He does, very much so. So I think Dursma would definitely go as one of the North picks. I've heard read a lot of other reports about McKercher being the other guy. I'm not 100% sold yet, though, that North Melbourne don't want Curtin. The full stop is that if West Coast keeps pick 1, they take Harley Reid. Harley Reid goes pick 1 no matter what. It just depends on who has the pick.
It's interesting, isn't it? So if West Coast have pick 1 and send it to North, is there a world where North take Curtin still with the pick that's left over?
Well,
because that's what West Coast don't want.
Yes.
It's almost as if we'll give you pick 1, but you've got to guarantee us you're not taking Curtin.
I think there'd be a bit of a gentleman's agreement in there, yes. And I think that happens a bit to a lesser extent certainly with academy bidding, like when clubs do trades with clubs that have Northern Academy players. So that's definitely a possibility that there would be a guarantee that North Melbourne wouldn't take Curtin, yeah.
So you're saying there is a possibility that if West Coast, it might be get pick 3 from North, and then they trade into pick 8.
Yeah.
That might be...
Could be enough.
That could be the slot to get Curtin, so they end up probably with McKercher and Curtin.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
That would make sense.
I think as being McKercher being the best pure mid, and I think West Coast struggles in the midfield this year have been well documented, I think that pick makes a lot of sense. He's a Tasmanian boy as well, so he's moving no matter what.
Yeah.
I can see the Tasmanian team in 5 years' time making a pretty big play to get him in the team.
Yeah. West Coast potentially might see themselves trying to go for a flag at that stage.
Yeah,
definitely. Well, stick with us a bit longer.
Agree.
So this is now the hard question, which you probably can't answer, but we need to talk about it. If they get the best pure mid in the draft and the best potential key defender who's got versatility, Daniel Curtin, is that a better result than getting Harley Reid?
I think it is because West Coast are at a point. We've been talking about this year about West Coast being year -1 of the rebuild because they've been in rebuild mode without, from a list perspective, not being in rebuild mode. So I'm in the, and this, I'd be interested to get your take on this, the whole East Coast v West Coast divide here. Like, I'm in the Joey Montagna bracket where I think West Coast need multiple players, and West Coast have already made a lot of moves in the off season with retirements and delistings and that kind of stuff. So I think they need to help accelerate their rebuild by getting multiple selections as early as they possibly can this year. And it dies off not reasonably quickly, but there's a strong top 10, I think, this year. And if West Coast can have 2 picks in the top 10, for mine, I think that's a more, even though Harley Reid is an incredible talent and I rate him extremely, extremely highly, I think you're better to go for volume when it comes to untried players.
So this is a conundrum that every West Coast fan is feeling right now.
Yeah.
And I imagine exactly the discussions they're having behind closed doors is potential generational talent who is the kind of guy that wins a Norm Smith on grand final day.
Very much
for
so.
you.
Yeah.
Is that worth trading in for what you hope to be 200, 250 game players who might win All Australians, whatever? Like it's an impossible question to answer, which is what makes this so hard.
If it was the NBA draft, you probably back yourself and take Reid because there's not as many players in a basketball team. But one player might not necessarily make a premiership side.
Yeah, and if he sees out his contract and then asks for a trade after 3 years, then it looks silly. But also, if Harley Reid ends up being a 5-time premiership player and a Brownlow medalist, then West Coast are just always the team that passed on the rights to Harley Reid. So it is such an interesting situation. This is something that I've thought about a bit. Do you think, is it too radical for West Coast to consider trading their future first to try and accelerate the rebuild by just getting another top 10 talent in now? Or is it too risky because if they come last again, then you've traded pick one?
So then you're then comparing the 2 crops, and everyone says it every year, but they're genuinely next year's draft at the top end is stronger.
Okay.
So, and like Fremantle have got themselves in a really good spot in next year's draft. I think they've got 3 first round picks in next year's draft, and whether they use that at the draft or they make a big play for a big fish, whatever. But they're a team that's well positioned for next year's draft, and that's a good place to be because the top end of next year's draft is excellent. Having said that, the top end of next year's draft, very heavily Victorian flavour. I don't think Western Australia's, there wasn't a lot of bottom ages in Western Australia's team this year in the Under-18 Championship. So the WA talent won't be if the WA talent this year is stronger than what I think it will be next year. So whether that comes into West Coast thinking, it never really does. They've always got pretty strong retention rate and in that sense. So yeah, that's what they'll be weighing up. I would think they'd be well served to try and get back into this year's draft and trying to get as many picks there. They're a proud club, and I don't think they like being down the bottom of the ladder for too long. I want to ask you, because every time we do a story about pick one, it goes bananas, right? But West Coast fans shoot it down all the time. So they think there's a Victorian media agenda that we're trying to get Harley Reid to stay in Victoria, which is ridiculous, obviously. But the West Coast fans don't like the idea of trading away pick one. They want to be staunch and back their development. Objectively, with a West Coast slant, do you think West Coast should be trying to get multiple picks in this year?
My view has flipped and flopped a lot because when I think about the possibility of bringing in a potentially Hall of Fame player, and it's silly to talk about an 18-year-old in that sense, but you can't help but project forward. And I always just think if you pass on potentially an all-time great, then that's something that can really set your club back. So there's part of me that just goes, Harley Reid in West Coast team round 1 next year, he could be anything. He could be in top 5 in our best and fairest after 1 year. And
he could have played AFL this year.
Supposedly he loves going out on the boat in Tongala. I was like, mate, Tongala Lake compared to Cottesloe, Trig.
The Swan.
Well, the Swan River's not much to write about.
Now it's Scarborough Beach, baby.
But, water sports is like Perth's number one thing. There's going to be 335 days of sunshine for the next 3 years of his contract. It's be hard. I think at the end of that 3 years, it'd be hard for him to turn his back on Perth if he turns out to be the kind of guy that he appears to be. You can always fly home and see your family, but
he's from a pretty remote rural town anyway. So I spoke to him for 20 minutes at the draft combine, and yeah, he's an impressive character, but he's just a kid as well. Like all of them are, but there are different levels of life experiences that they've all gone through, and Harley's a kid, and so it would be, like for any player, it would be a significant adjustment to move into state, but ultimately he's so good that he'd probably let his footy do the talking at the same time.
So I want us to draft Sean Maker from Tassie
Or Ari.
and I think put them two in a share house together and let them run amok and get themselves settled into Perth, and they'll find out pretty quickly what it's all about.
Ari's a first round bolter, no doubt about that.
Absolute cannon of a left foot.
194 centimetres. So he's got the size to be a third tall, but he told me a couple of weeks ago that he has, because he focused so much on his rebounding and his kicking this year, that he's probably lost a little bit of his intercept ability. So he needs to try and get that back. But he says it is there. So if he can find that balance, he's going to be a very appealing prospect.
Well,
for an AFL.
I think the Eagles should trade up for him because I think he's our Shannon Hearn. I think he's our Shannon Hearn replacement with the super boot out of the back line. But and looking forward to Kobe Bergiel hopefully getting a crack off the half-back flank.
Yeah.
Cruelled by hamstring.
Yes.
So hopefully things turn around for him. Anyway, we could probably go for a while longer. But
because you know what? Because we just had the trade period, we had 36 deals go down. But I still think this is the most intriguing trade storyline where the West Coast move on pick one of the entire year. And as I mentioned, it'll probably go right up until November 20.
Well, Harley Reid was the biggest name in the trade period, even though he wasn't actually an AFL player.
Yeah,
nah,
100%.
Appreciate it, Ben.
Drew, a real career highlight to be on the nest with you here.
Thanks, mate.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.